Welcome, welcome, welcome to Week Old Beans episode 10. I am back, and I actually have my co-host with me. Fowler, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
I am Fowler. I was the co-host of another podcast with a worse name, but then I jumped ship, and I'm glad to be part of a podcast that has a good name.
Yeah, I don't know what Fowler's talking about. Um, I don't know what podcast that was. I don't know, Fowler, if you maybe might have bonked your head a little too hard when you were on vacation, and you're coming back with some amnesia. But I was not present for any poorly named podcast. Uh,
you can lie all you want or not, but
no, I
the
no, I
people have seen it,
the people haven't seen shit because I changed all the names, so there is no evidence.
except for the beginning being "Welcome to the Unnamed Podcast," unless you edited it, which hats off to you if you went that far.
You know what's fucked
To
up? I haven't edited it, and I just realized that I didn't edit it when you brought it up. So the first like 7 episodes of this are a different name. But you know what? We're still testing out our equipment. This is a test run. I know we're on episode 10, but whatever. But anyway, this is shut up, Fowler. This is episode 10 of Week Old Beans, where we recap the week's news. Now, Fowler and I have both been kind of slacking. I've had one hell of a month, so the past couple days, the past week of my life has been unbelievably hectic, and Fowler's been on vacation, but so we've both been kind of slacking with the news recently. But there have been some new revelations. There's been a couple new Trump indictments pertaining to the Mar-a-Lago case. However, we're not going to talk about that in this episode just because it's too early and there's just
we want to wait till all the stuff is out. It's all very speculative at this point, and I think we learned our lesson from the Russian story we covered, where we said it looked like it was going to be a civil war, and then like the next day,
yeah, like an
the
hour.
army just the army just left, and everything was fine.
um, yeah, so we're being speculative about that sort of stuff now. So we won't talk about that. What we're going to really talk about is some campaign news, and we're going to talk about the great state of Florida. It's an area that I've been avoiding talking about because I feel like it's kind of like the Tatooine of the United States at this point. Um,
Well,
uh,
it'll be the opposite of the Tatooine in 20 years when it's underwater because of climate
yeah, it's
change.
going to be Camino basically. Um, it's it's dry, it's oppressive, um, uh, broke as hell, but a lot of important people and a lot of important shit is happening there, so we kind of have to pay attention to it, just like Tatooine. Uh, no offense to any of my viewers who are from Florida. I really, I'm sorry. That's all I have to say about it.
Our dog can't talk because not to dox them, but they are in the South, and their state does pop up in the news as well.
Yeah, a little fucking too much for my fucking liking. But I digress. I won't dox myself, but I am from the South. But Florida's not like, I don't know. Florida's they're built different down there. I don't think we've talked about Ron DeSantis on this podcast. Fowler, why don't you go ahead and give the people some knowledge about the current presidential candidate, Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida.
Yeah, so Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida. He's getting his ass handed to him by Donald Trump in the Republican primary, but
Embarrassing.
he's very interesting. DeSantis has made his entire image being anti-woke, and he defines woke as the idea that there is inequality in America and fixing it would be a good thing. That's how his lawyers defined it in court. What
Yeah, they
wokeness
basically
is.
said wokeness is the idea that like there is like racism and that we should not be racist. That's basically what it was.
Right. And so DeSantis has attacked wokeness as an ideology in many ways. But the way that we're going to talk about it on the podcast today and the one that I think is most dangerous is erasing history. Ron DeSantis is determined to shape education to remove problematic elements of it that point to inequality or racism or prejudice, and sort of to cleanse American history of a lot of the darker truths about it.
Well, and he's
Um,
what his strategy, and this is not just the strategy in Florida, but this is also the strategy in other states that are kind of attempting the same sort of manipulation of history. Although Florida has spearheaded the attempt, and they're also probably the most egregious attempt that we've seen so far. But they're doing all this under the basis of, you know, teaching that there is inequality, or teaching about the origins of inequality makes white people, I hate to single out groups of people, but really it's a race thing, so we kind of have to use racial quantifiers, unfortunately. But um, under the guise that teaching these elements of history not only are not only are, in their words, ahistorical, but they also make white people uncomfortable. The mere mention of, like, you know racism in its historical context causes discomfort amongst white students, which I don't know if this is true, you know? Um, like, I don't know if, I would imagine that this is a projection, Um, and it's interesting that, this is the same demographic of people that would bitch and moan that, people on the left are snowflakes, that people on the left take things too seriously and that they need to just loosen up and stop being fucking pussies. Yet for some reason, the thought of their high schooler having to learn that, like, you know, segregation bad, um, or not even segregation bad, because saying that
segregation existed.
segregation existed, is somehow causes discomfort. As if
I mean,
history is meant to be comforting.
it's the age-old story that knowledge is power, and what a lot of um, history is really outside of its academic position is basically like controlling the narrative of what happened and why it happened in order to benefit you. The Southerner like lost cause myth is probably the most powerful example of it in history, of like arguing that essentially it wasn't about slavery, the Civil War was about states' rights, and the South fought a glorious but ultimately destined to fail crusade against the North, who only beat them due to superior armaments and guns and economy. And this anti wokeness
So hang
is.
on, you mean all of the things that make, like, an army better? They only beat us by
Fair.
having better generals, more ammunition, more resources, more intelligent strategists, and better soldiers.
And more people.
And more
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like all of the things that make someone likely or less likely to win a war. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, exactly. And this anti wokeness is the same thing. It's erasing inequality and a history of inequality, so that I think people are less inclined to take social justice seriously, and also as a way of defanging, Floridians who, under like new guidelines might not learn about civil rights, really might learn misinformation about slavery, like that slaves were benefited from being enslaved because they were taught useful skills. It's a way of putting everyone to sleep and ensuring there won't be change in a systemic way, in the way that the Republican Party fears, because they are um, the people who survive and get fat on the corruption and inequality in this country.
Well, not just that. I think it speaks to a deeper issue. The idea that, like, and I think we've talked about this before, Fowler, like with the Nazis, right? Um, you could make the argument that all teachings are propaganda to an extent. That whenever you present information to someone, your own biases are going to creep into that presentation, whether you like it or not. Um, you know what I mean? But I don't necessarily think that's always a bad thing, you know. Um, I think having moral stipulations in regards to history is not really that bad. Now, obviously, you can judge people within the context of the time, you know, and I am not saying that we need to present historical figures as these um, as these black and white, morally good slash morally bad figures. Although we do that anyway. I grew up under an education system that did that to begin with. The founding fathers and all these historical figures. They were, uh, you know, could do no wrong, and their flaws were never discussed seriously, if not mentioned only in passing. But it speaks, I think, to the idea that like it's okay to sort of take a stand about something, you know.
Mm.
Um, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing for an education system to say, hey, the Nazis were bad. Hey, slavery was bad. There's no like black and white, you know. The stories, the individuals, their stories are most definitely black and white, you know. The story of the slave and the story of the master, the relationship between both of those individuals most certainly could be presented, um, you know, in black and white. You know, the the history of slavery is very interesting. There's a lot of interesting stories that were recorded. You know, very few of them because by enslaved people themselves because they couldn't. Most of them couldn't read or write. But the ones that we do have that survived are certainly you know not black and white. But at the end of the day, the institution, you know, the proliferation of slavery throughout the 13 colonies and the states, I think should be presented as a moral slight in America's history. And
Yeah.
I'm not really bothered by it being presented that way.
I mean, history can be presented as a bunch of disconnected facts and dates, but like that isn't really an effective way of teaching anyone anything. And I think it removes like the important moral context that's necessary for like evaluating history and judging history. For as long as there's history, there will be fights over how that history is told and what stories or narratives we we take from it, I think.
Yeah. And I hear language, coming from not just Florida, but other states where they say like, oh, you know, we need to have professors present unbiased interpretations of these historical facts, which is impossible because nobody can interpret things in an unbiased manner. You know,
Mm.
um, if you have a black professor or a black teacher, they're not going to be able to present slavery as some sort of like you know um,
Positive, yeah.
positive. It's not going to happen. Um,
What speaks to how the Republican Party is increasingly denying reality. There were subtle ways that they would undermine history, but with like the way that Florida is going to teach about slavery, this isn't just like omitting certain facts to create a narrative. It's the fabrication of reality, which is something the Republican Party increasingly needs to do because their ideas are insane and their policy doesn't make any sense. It only works in a fantasy world.
yeah, and another thing, and for those of you listening who are you know privy to American history, um, African American slaves did learn useful skills that they took with them. Um, but whenever they tried to use those skills, they were effectively blackballed and terrorized by the white populace. So I don't really know what point is trying to be made with the idea that slaves learned useful skills. They learned useful skills, but they couldn't use those skills. They knew how to farm, but they were barred from owning land. They knew
And
how to.
there were skills that were illegal. Like it was illegal for a lot of slavery for you to teach slaves how to read or write because they understood doing so would create a professional class of African Americans that would be dangerous to the hierarchy in the South at that time
Yeah. The enslaved people that learned how to read or write, uh, you know, free slaves who escaped and learned how to read or write later on. And then typically, if you were enslaved, if you knew how to read or write, it was because you were the son or daughter of a master. uh, if you were black and you knew how to read or write, chances are your father uh, was a white man and your mother
Hmm.
was black. That was kind of the demographic that was allowed those privileges within an enslaved household.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, it makes me think. I guess this is like a little bit of a step back, but it makes me think about like the postmodernists who argued that like, all narratives were kind of what's the word? Subjective, and there wasn't really a greater real truth to reality or history. And I don't know if I agree necessarily with that. Like I think there are some facts about the way the world works or the way history moves that are just inherently kind of true, you know? But that
could
is
you
up for debate.
could you give me an example of one of those?
Um so modernists, which include like communists, is probably the most common example. Modernists argue that like the narratives of history are like a couple, and that basically by understanding those narratives you can understand history. And the postmodernists were a reaction to that, where they essentially argued that history history is entirely subjective, and there aren't like universal true narratives to the way the world works. Those grand narratives of like modernism, of like, for example, class warfare being the reason society like evolved through the feudal and early capitalist periods. Like the postmodernists would argue that that's untrue, and that those narratives are just like the subjective spin we put on like an inherently patternless universe.
I don't know if I disagree with that. Um, I think there are definitely certain narratives that are consistent throughout history. I definitely think, I mean, if I had to be kind of nihilistic about it, I think all of history is just people with space, people with power, trying to find a way to either expand their power or to maintain the power that they already have.
Hmm.
And that's all history is. Um,
And I guess there are some truths, like maybe not about grander narratives of history, but like internal attributes that are the same, like the way power works or the way hierarchies work, you know?
yeah, it's difficult to talk about, and I think it's difficult to analyze as the world gets more complicated because um, that all manifests itself in different ways. The way that the United States maintains its global dominance is no longer through boots on the ground. Um, the way the empires are formed and the way the empires are going to be formed in the future is not going to be through sending soldiers to raid and pillage and hold territory. It's going to be through economic warfare and cyber
Yeah.
warfare. Um, that's the new reality that we live in, and so um, the game is still the same, but the rules have shifted.
Yes.
Um,
Our tools are so much more sophisticated than they were in the 20th
yeah,
century.
but it's still basically the same goal. Economic or resource extraction. Um,
Hmm.
the extraction of resources from people who can't defend themselves. Um, the crafting of narratives that work to reinforce that extraction. Um,
It kind of blows my mind how
and
like
it,
for almost all of human history, like people were fighting under like false flags. Like the king didn't give a shit about you in the feudal era, and like most of human history, it's people dying for tyrants and fools and monsters. It's very rare for you to live in an era of history where what you fight for or die for is actually worthwhile, and what you fight for and die for is something that's worthwhile to you as a normal person, you know?
yeah. Um, No, I definitely agree with that. Um, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens with this. And it'll be interesting to see. I don't think DeSantis is going to win. Um, I don't think he's anywhere close to the White House. The showdown is going to be between Trump and Biden, unfortunately. But you know, DeSantis and his sort of war on wokeness is, I think, a perfect example of what you just said: rallying people under a false flag, under a false king. Wokeness doesn't fucking mean anything. None of these dipshits that are fighting to end wokeness, that are making 10,000 YouTube videos talking about go woke, go broke, you know, um, DeSantis will discard them, you know, and discard their support the minute it's no longer useful to him. But hatred is a very potent and powerful tool in a politician's arsenal.
Very
Um,
much so.
you know, people are,
It's what kept the Dixiecrats alive for decades,
yeah,
is people's fear and hatred of African Americans.
yeah, and it's just, um, only time will tell whether or not, you know, we are living in an era where that hatred just finally is no longer politically effective. Um, and DeSantis is sort of the poster boy for that, I think.
The other thing that DeSantis represents that I think is very interesting is he represents the abstracting of enemies. Like Trump was very explicit, like Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, Muslims are terrorists. It was like a very direct way of pointing to them. Whereas DeSantis, while he attacks those same people, he argues under this idea of wokeness as an ideology. He's not going after specific ethnic groups. He's going after this um, philosophy. And if it happens that that philosophy is a lot of brown people, well, that's just the way the world works. And it reminds me a lot of the Southern strategy of talking about race without talking about race, talking about schooling and crime and small businesses in a way that targeted African Americans without explicitly saying that. And I think
Yeah.
it'll be very interesting to see what the Republican Party and the Republican voter sticks to the more overt forms of prejudice, or whether, like DeSantis, they will increasingly, to pull in moderates, abstract their enemies so that it doesn't seem as overt that they're targeting people.
Yeah. Wokeness is interesting because it I mean, it includes LGBTQ people as well. So I think DeSantis' strategy was to, you know, um, utilize the dislike for LGBTQ people, um, and include them in the woke umbrella. Um, and because wokeness is so abstract, sorry, I was yawning. Because wokeness is so abstract, it can really mean whatever you want it to mean. But there's some caveats to that, I think, as well. The abstractiveness means that it's harder to sell.
I agree. It could be that politicians who attempt to target wokeness or abstract racial politics, they'll just get destroyed in the primary by someone who's willing to say the N word, basically.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Uh,
And I think Trump beating DeSantis so badly right now also indicates the Overton window hasn't shifted yet.
yeah. Um, yeah, I definitely agree with you. Um, well, Trump even said, I mean, Trump said that wokeness is too abstract and that nobody knows what it means, and nobody does know what it means. Um,
Trump is a funny con man because he does lie to his audience, but he's so stupid that he often tells them later that he's lying to them.
yes, that is true. One of the other things too, I think, with the caveat of like wokeness as a political tool is um, we're living in a time now where America is more, I guess, scattered than ever in terms of like ethnic demographics. Um,
Hmm.
and, and not just ethnicity, but also LGBTQ Americans. You have, I mean, just women, like just women as a voting bloc. Um, I think one of the things with wokeness that DeSantis has to be careful about is like, if everything is woke, and everything is fueling wokeness, of having a gay character, having a woman, having a black guy, having a Mexican, having a fucking Asian, you've just now singled out like literally everybody in the United States. Like you've just essentially alienated a huge demographics in America.
Because I agree with you. The other thing that I think makes this more complicated is I think it's easier, especially if we're talking about historical racism, it's easier when the South is segregated to demonize black people because the society is so separate that like those aren't people you interact with or create relationships with, so it's easier to demonize them. Most people know someone who is gay. Most
Anti-Semitism is
people,
also a really good example of this as well.
yeah, and I think it's harder to demonize it because even if you're a homophobe, like most homophobes have met gay people, and gay people are in every strata of life. They're upper class, they're middle class, they're lower class. They're black, they're white, and so I think it's a much harder thing to go after um, than race politics.
Yeah, it's almost too big of an umbrella. The separation is the point. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Fowler, but I was, to the anti-Semitism. One of the things that makes anti-Semitism so effective is the lack of knowledge about Jews. Is
Mm.
the fact that Jews are a small minority. Not many people know about them, unless you live up in New York or certain places in Florida or out in California. You most likely don't live in an area with a very prominent Jewish population. So they're the perfect boogeyman, you know. Um,
Yeah,
they're the perfect boogeyman for somebody who is looking to fuel, uh, to scapegoat a demographic for, if you're a politician, it's usually your own failures as a politician or your own unwillingness as a politician because you just don't give a shit. Uh, but you need someone to blame for why your district is fucking falling apart. Um, and you can't just say it's because I'm not doing my job. You gotta say it's because the Jews made it that way. You know, uh, you gotta just make some shit up. Um, or, if you're like a normal person, you need someone to blame for your own lack of success. So you gotta, it's the Jews that are making it so that my credit score is dog shit because they control the banks.
I have heard there are some people who argue, like I think Vosh is someone who does. There are people who argue that like the new anti-Semitism is transphobia. That like a lot of the tropes are the same. That like trans people are scheming and manipulating, and they don't directly like use force or violence, but they groom people and control people in order to achieve their goals. That they wield institutions like the educational system or the medical system in order to like push their propaganda insidiously. And I think people have argued and I do think it's an interesting argument that like a lot of the bones of anti-Semitism are the same ones that are used to fuel transphobia.
I agree with you. I think I I think what makes anti-Semitism so dangerous, though, and I agree with you that the skeletons are the same, but I still think anti-Semitism is the driving force, is because transphobia, and maybe this will change. Maybe we'll transphobia will reach a crescendo where you start having politicians saying that actually the World Economic Forum is being controlled by like secret trans cat girls. But um, I think the Jewish conspiracy is just so big. You know what I mean? Like it's the conspiracy that these people come up with when it comes to anti-Semitism is just it reaches into every corner of society. You know what I mean? Like nobody's saying that like trans people control the World Economic Forum or that transgender people control like the World Bank or that like transgender people are in control of you know uh like these multi-billion-dollar corporations that are responsible for world events. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? But I agree with you that the skeleton is still the same. I'm not trying to say that one is worse than the other, but I definitely think like it's the same rhetoric and it's the same sort of framework. Um, but I ultimately think that like, and I think you and I talked about this, and you remember you told me one time that they don't need to create a new anti-Semitism; they can just use the same old anti-Semitism, and it
Yeah.
seems to be working just fine.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because different parts of the Republican Party are using different types of bigotries to achieve their goals. Like, I think the more anti-Semitic rhetoric are the way people frame the deep state, which I think is often done in a very anti-Semitic way, and the way they tie prominent Jewish people like Soros to it, I think
Yeah,
is really, yeah.
I definitely agree with you. It's fuck, it's crazy. I guess that's all I have to say. I'm getting a little tired, Fowler. Do you want to talk about anything else on the podcast? We're hitting about 35 minutes right now. A little shorter than what we normally
Sure.
do.
Sure. Or do you want to end it now, or do you want to talk a little bit about drama?
I mean, I don't know what else there is to really say about the drama.
Well, I mean, the drama is a separate topic.
Oh, yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. I don't really know if there's any useful commentary I could add. Um, People be crazy. That's all I'll say about the drama. Fowler, do you want to add anything?
That's okay. We can end early.
I gotta get up for work tomorrow, y'all. Forgive me, I've had a fucking hell of a month. Um, any closing words, Fowler, that you want to add?
Um,
It's a bit of a short
I think
podcast.
it's I think it's very important when you learn about history or really anything in general to think about like what narratives are in this thing that I'm consuming, like um who benefits from these narratives, and to make sure that um you understand if they're being used in order to control you.
Yeah, um, I definitely agree. And I think when you read history, you just have to be impartial. You have to be partially impartial. You know what I mean? You have to look at history as it happened, and you have to look at it truthfully, and you have to look at it, and ask yourself, like, what can I get from this narrative? Um, I think American history is just a very contentious topic because we want to tell the truth, but it's an uncomfortable truth. The American story is a very uncomfortable story. Um,
Hmm.
and I think a lot of people are finally starting to realize this, But that discomfort doesn't necessarily mean that you need to not learn about it, nor does it mean that um, you have to hold the history, against the country. Um, I think a lot of this is just we as Americans are used to being on top. We're used to being told that we're, the shining beacon at the top of the hill. Um, but as a wise man once said, no cultures are beautiful. Every culture is hideous and ugly.
Who said that?
Zizek. No culture is beautiful. All cultures are hideous, ugly, and monstrous. Um,
Oh, Zizek.
that's just the way the world works.
Hmm.
Um, and you know, and maybe it's the maybe narratives. I think kids when they're young, I think, giving kids a good narrative is important. It doesn't completely destroy their soul. Um, you know what I mean? But um, I don't really know what else. I mean, I agree with Fowler here. Um, read up always, ask questions, and if something makes you uncomfortable, sit with the discomfort. We gotta get better about being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Very true.
I think we're very uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. We just don't like to be uncomfortable.
And I think that's why every nation attempts to erase the horrors of what it causes. I mean, my people, the Japanese, they have been in denial politically and education wise about what they did to the Chinese and the Koreans during World War II for like 80 years now. And it's still a taboo topic in their education and politics. But all that hiding the truth does is it makes you vulnerable for other people's manipulations, and it stops you from truly resolving or fixing the problems that are in the world and that are in your nation.
Yeah. Well, and being uncomfortable means that you're a human being. Don't ever forget that. The fact that you're uncomfortable with history just means that you're a person.
Hmm.
That's all it means. It's not an admission of guilt. If you're like a white guy and you read about slavery and you feel uncomfortable because you feel some sort of guilt, it just means you're a person. That's all that means. It means you're a human being with thoughts and feelings, that you empathize with the people that you're reading about. You know?
Yeah, very true.
But we'll leave it at that. I gotta go to bed, y'all. I'm tired.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you guys like the podcast. Fowler, it's good to have you back. I miss my co host, even though I only did one episode. Uh, so I've been working hard since you've not been here.
You done good.
Thank you. Y'all, and y'all have a good rest of your night, and I will see you in the next podcast.